The glass walls of the Sterling Tower overlooked the city like the eyes of a cold, indifferent god. On the 42nd floor, Arthur Sterling, a man whose net worth was measured in 9 figures, sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of rare ebony. To Arthur, the world was a collection of assets and liabilities. People were either tools to be used or obstacles to be cleared. It was 7 p.m. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the skyscrapers in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. Arthur was frustrated. A multi-million-dollar merger was stalling because of a minor legal technicality, and his patience was wearing thin. The heavy oak door of his office creaked open slightly. Arthur didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew the schedule. An elderly woman in a faded blue uniform entered, pushing a cart that rattled with the scent of pine cleaner and bleach. Her name was Martha, though Arthur had never bothered to learn it. To him, she was simply the cleaner, a seasonal background noise, like the hum of the air conditioning or the distant siren of an ambulance. Martha moved with a slight limp, her back curved from years of labor. She began to empty the wastebasket near the door, her movements methodical and quiet. She was careful not to disturb the silence of the room. "You're late," Arthur snapped, his eyes still fixed on his computer screen. "You were supposed to be here 10 minutes ago. I have an important call starting soon." Martha paused, clutching a plastic trash bag. Her hands were weathered, the skin like parchment paper with blue veins mapping out a long life. "I am sorry, Mr. Sterling," she said in a soft, gravelly voice. "The elevator in the east wing was stuck. I had to take the stairs." Arthur let out a sharp, mocking exhale. "Excuses don't clean floors, Martha, or whatever your name is. Just finish up and get out. And try not to bang that cart against the walls. This wallpaper costs more than your annual salary." Martha didn't flinch. She had heard similar words for 15 years. She simply nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand." As she moved closer to his desk to wipe the glass surfaces, Arthur pulled his expensive leather chair back with a look of visible disgust, as if her presence might contaminate his tailored Italian suit. He watched her for a moment, her gray hair tied in a neat bun, her tired eyes focused on a smudge of dust. "Tell me," Arthur started, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you ever regret it? Spending your entire life scrubbing floors for people who actually built something? Doesn't it feel insignificant?" Martha stopped scrubbing. She looked at him, not with anger, but with a strange, haunting pity that Arthur couldn't quite understand. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered. "Every floor I clean allows someone to walk without slipping. Every desk I dust allows a mind to think clearly. No work is insignificant if it serves another. It is not the height of the chair you sit in that matters, but how you treat those who stand below it." Arthur laughed, a cold and hollow sound. "Philosophy from a mop bucket. That's rich. Just finish the windows, Martha. Some of us have a world to run." Martha finished her work in silence. As she pushed her cart out of the room, she left behind the scent of lemon and a small, handmade paper crane on the edge of the hallway table, a habit Arthur had never even noticed. Arthur returned to his spreadsheets, convinced that he was the giant and she was the ant. He had no idea that the ant had once held the world on her shoulders, and that his own empire was built on a foundation he was about to discover was far more fragile than his ego. The following week brought a relentless storm to the city. Lightning flickered across the skyline, and rain lashed against the windows of the Sterling Tower. Arthur was in a foul mood. The merger had hit another snag, and his personal driver was stuck in traffic, leaving him stranded in his office later than usual. As the clock struck 8 p.m., Arthur grabbed his briefcase and headed toward the elevators. The hallway was dimly lit to save energy, casting long, eerie shadows on the marble floor. Near the service entrance, he saw a figure huddled by the glass doors. It was Martha. She was wearing a thin, worn-out raincoat that looked like it hadn't been waterproof in a decade. She was clutching a thick, brown envelope to her chest as if it were a bar of gold, protecting it from the damp air. "Still here?" Arthur asked, his voice echoing in the empty hall. The buses stopped running on this route 20 minutes ago due to the flooding. Martha looked up, startled. I know, Mr. Sterling. I am waiting for the rain to slow down. I have something important to deliver tonight. Arthur glanced at the envelope. It was stained and tattered at the edges. Deliver? In this weather? Whatever is in that paper bag can't be worth a pneumonia, Martha. Buy a new one tomorrow. It cannot wait, sir, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. It's a deadline. A young man's future depends on what is inside this. Arthur rolled his eyes. Always the drama with your people. Good luck then. He pushed past her and walked toward his private parking garage. However, as he reached his car, he realized he had left his encrypted flash drive, containing the merger's secret contracts, on his desk. With a groan of frustration, he turned back. When he reached the lobby again, Martha was gone. But on the floor near the service door, where she had been standing, lay the thick brown envelope. She must have dropped it in her rush to catch a passing taxi or in a moment of physical weakness. Arthur picked it up, intending to toss it into the lost and found bin. But the flap of the envelope was unsealed, and as he lifted it, several documents slid out onto the floor. He reached down to gather them, but his eyes caught a glimpse of a letterhead. The Royal Academy of Medicine, Scholarship Department. Arthur paused. His curiosity, fueled by a lifelong habit of gathering intelligence, got the better of him. He pulled the documents out completely. There were medical journals, handwritten notes in complex Latin, and a series of certificates, but what stopped his heart for a split second was a photograph clipped to a bank statement. It was a picture of a young man in a graduation gown, smiling broadly. Attached to it was a letter written in elegant, shaky handwriting, to the Dean of Admissions, please find enclosed the final payment for David's tuition. It is everything I have saved over the last 12 years. I know my son has the hands of a surgeon and the heart of a healer. Do not let his poverty blind you to his brilliance. I will continue to work 3 jobs to ensure his residency is covered. Please, give him the chance the world denied me. Arthur looked at the bank statement. Every month, for 15 years, a deposit of exactly $800 had been made. Martha's entire salary. Every single cent she earned at Sterling Tower was being funneled into a prestigious medical school. He looked at the date on the bank statement. It was dated today. This was the deadline. Without this deposit and these original transcripts, the young man, her son, would be dropped from the program. Suddenly, the insignificant woman who cleaned his toilets looked very different in Arthur's mind. He looked out at the pouring rain. She was out there somewhere, likely frantic, searching for the envelope that held her son's entire future. Arthur looked at his gold watch. The bank's night drop box closed in 30 minutes. The Academy's administrative office was across town. For the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling didn't think about profit margins. He thought about the woman who had stood in his office while he insulted her, all while she was carrying the weight of a future surgeon on her tired back. He gripped the envelope and ran toward his car. Arthur's Mercedes roared to life. He ignored the speed limits, his wipers struggling to clear the sheets of water hitting the windshield. Why am I doing this? He muttered to himself, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He knew why. He remembered his own father, a man who had given him everything on a silver platter. Arthur had always believed he was successful because he was smarter and harder working than everyone else. But looking at Martha's bank statement had cracked that illusion. He hadn't worked a tenth as hard as she did. He had started at the finish line. She was running the race with lead weights tied to her ankles. He reached the Academy's administrative building with only 5 minutes to spare. He sprinted through the rain, his $3,000 suit getting soaked to the skin. He reached the night clerk's window just as the man was pulling the shutter down. Wait! Arthur shouted, slamming his hand against the glass. The clerk looked annoyed. We're closed, sir. You aren't closed until I say you are, Arthur barked, slipping back into his persona of power, but this time for a different purpose. He shoved the envelope through the slot. This is for David Miller's medical residency file. It needs to be stamped and processed tonight. Check the contents. Everything is there. The clerk opened the envelope, seeing the name and the prestigious Sterling Tower logo on the business card Arthur accidentally included. The clerk's attitude changed instantly. Of course, Mr. Sterling. I'll see to it personally. Arthur stood under the awning of the building, catching his breath. He was drenched, his hair was a mess, and he looked nothing like the billionaire who appeared on the cover of Forbes. He drove back to the Sterling Tower, expecting to find Martha there, perhaps crying or searching the floors. But the building was quiet. He asked the night security guard if he had seen her. Mrs. Miller? Yeah. She left about an hour ago, sir. She looked devastated. She was wandering around the parking lot in the rain, looking for something. I tried to help, but she just kept saying, "I've lost his life, I've lost his life." She looked broken, sir. Arthur felt a sharp pang of guilt in his chest. It was a sensation he wasn't familiar with. It felt like a physical weight. Find out where she lives, Arthur ordered the guard. Sir. We aren't supposed to give out employee addresses. I own the building, Frank. Give me the address. Minutes later, Arthur was driving toward a part of the city he had only ever seen from the window of a helicopter. The buildings were cramped, the streets were narrow and filled with potholes, and the neon signs of pawn shops flickered in the dark. He pulled up in front of a crumbling apartment complex. He climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, the smell of damp carpet and cheap cooking oil filling his nose. He reached apartment 4B. He knocked, silenced. He knocked again, louder. Martha? It's Arthur Sterling. The door opened slowly. Martha stood there, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked smaller than she did at the office. She looked like a woman who had finally been defeated by a world that took too much and gave too little. Mr. Sterling, she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here? If it's about the office, I'll be there tomorrow. I need a moment to find something. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the receipt the clerk had given him. He held it out to her. You don't need to find it, Martha, he said, his voice unusually soft. It's been delivered. David is in. Martha stared at the receipt in Arthur's hand, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't take it at first, she simply looked at it as if it were a mirage that might disappear if she reached out. When her fingers finally brushed the paper, she began to shake. You took it there, she whispered, looking up at the drenched billionaire standing in her dim hallway. But why? You didn't even know my name an hour ago. Arthur felt a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. I saw the documents, Martha. I saw how long you've been doing this. I realized I've been walking past a hero every day and calling her a ghost. Martha stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The apartment was tiny, hardly larger than Arthur's walk-in closet, but it was spotlessly clean. The walls were covered not with expensive art, but with framed certificates, old photographs, and shelves of thick medical textbooks. Arthur noticed a framed photograph on a small wooden table. It wasn't the boy. It was a younger Martha, standing in front of a prestigious university in Europe, wearing a white lab coat. Is this you? Arthur asked, stunned. Martha sat down on a worn velvet chair, the adrenaline of her panic finally fading into exhaustion. A long time ago, Mr. Sterling. I was a researcher. I studied molecular biology in Prague. I had dreams of finding cures, of changing the world with science. Arthur turned to her, his brow furrowed. Then how did you end up here? How did someone with your mind end up emptying my trash cans? Martha smiled sadly. Life is what happens when you are making other plans. My husband was a brilliant man, but he became very ill. We moved to this country for a specialized treatment that cost more than our lives were worth. I took any job I could find to keep him alive. Then, when he passed, I was left with a mountain of debt and a young son who had inherited his father's brilliant mind but none of his luck. She looked at the photo of her son, David. I made a choice. I could spend my life fighting to get back into a lab, or I could spend my life making sure David never had to see the inside of a cleaning closet. I chose him. Arthur looked around the room. He saw the sacrifices in every corner, the patched-up curtains, the single light bulb to save electricity, the stack of ramen noodles in the kitchen. For 15 years, this woman had suppressed her own intellect, her own ego, and her own comfort to build a bridge for someone else. I called your work insignificant, Arthur said, his voice cracking. I told you that you hadn't built anything. You only saw the mop, Mr. Sterling, Martha replied gently. You didn't see the doctor I was polishing. The next morning, Arthur arrived at Sterling Tower earlier than usual. He didn't go to his office. Instead, he went to the Human Resources Department. I want the records from Martha Miller, he demanded. The HR manager, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, scrambled to pull up the files. She's just contract staff, sir. There isn't much. Why? Is there a problem? We can have her replaced by noon if she's bothered you. Arthur slammed his hand on the desk, making Henderson jump. The only problem is this company's soul. I want to see her pay stubs for the last 10 years. Now. As Arthur reviewed the files, he felt a wave of nausea. Because Martha was a contractor, the company had been avoiding paying her health benefits or retirement contributions. She was being paid the absolute legal minimum, despite having never missed a single day of work in 15 years. Later that afternoon, Arthur sat in a high-stakes board meeting. The room was filled with men in suits worth more than Martha's apartment building. They were discussing cost-cutting measures and optimizing human capital. We can save 4% annually if we outsource the maintenance and janitorial staff to a third-party firm in South Asia, one director suggested, flipping through a slide deck. The current staff is an unnecessary overhead. Arthur stood up. The room went silent. Normally, Arthur was the one leading the charge for higher profits. An unnecessary overhead? Arthur repeated, his voice dangerously low. We are sitting in a building that is kept spotless by people who have more dignity in their pinky fingers than this entire board has in its collective DNA. Arthur, it's just business, a senior partner said, confused. No, it's not just business. It's blindness, Arthur snapped. He projected a photo onto the large screen in the boardroom. It wasn't a graph. It was the photo of Martha in her lab coat from years ago. This is the woman who cleans my office, Arthur told them. She has a degree in molecular biology. She has sacrificed her entire existence to put a surgeon through school. And we sit here, debating how to shave a few dollars off her survival wage so we can buy a second yacht? The board members shifted uncomfortably. From this day forward, Arthur announced, Sterling Tower will not only double the wages of all maintenance staff, but we will establish a legacy scholarship fund. We will pay for the education of any employee's child who shows the merit to succeed. And we will start with Martha Miller's son. You can't do that without a vote, someone protested. I own 51% of the shares, Arthur barked. Watch me. That evening, Arthur waited in his office. He didn't stay to work. He stayed to wait. At 7 p.m., the door creaked open. Martha entered with her cart. She stopped when she saw him sitting there. She looked worried, perhaps thinking he was there to fire her for his visit to her home. Mr. Sterling. I am sorry if I am late again. Arthur stood up. He walked over to her, but he didn't pull his chair away this time. He stood right in front of her. Martha, he said. I spoke to the board today. Your son's remaining tuition and his entire residency will be covered by the company. It's not a gift. It's a debt we owe you for 15 years of undervalued service. Martha's hand went to her mouth. Sir. I didn't ask for charity. It's not charity, Martha. It's justice, Arthur replied. He reached into his desk and pulled out a small, blue folder. And there's something else. We are opening a new biotech research wing in the suburban campus next month. We need a senior administrative consultant, someone who understands the science but also knows how to manage the environment. He handed her the folder. The salary listed was 10 times what she was making now. You don't have to pick up another trash can ever again, Martha. Unless you want to. Martha looked at the folder, then at Arthur. For the first time, Arthur saw her as a peer. But more importantly, he saw himself as he truly was, a man who had been poor in spirit despite his riches. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, a tear rolling down her cheek. Arthur looked at the small paper crane she had left on his table weeks ago. He picked it up. "Because," Arthur said quietly, "I finally realized that you weren't the one living in my shadow. I was the one living in yours." The transition from a blue uniform to a professional suit was not as easy as Arthur had imagined it would be for Martha. For 15 years, she had practiced the art of being invisible. To suddenly be seen, to be consulted, respected, and greeted by name, was a shock to her system. On her first day at the new biotech wing, Arthur met her at the entrance. He had personally overseen the setup of her office. It wasn't tucked away in a basement, it was a bright, glass-walled space overlooking the garden. "You look like you belong here," Arthur said, noticing her discomfort as she tugged at the sleeve of her new blazer. "I feel like a ghost who accidentally walked back into the world of the living, Mr. Sterling," Martha replied, her voice soft. "I keep looking for my cart. My hands feel too light without a mop." "That weight you feel is gone, Martha. You've carried it long enough," Arthur said firmly. However, not everyone was as welcoming as Arthur. The corporate world is a shark tank. And word had spread quickly that the cleaning lady had been promoted to a senior role. In the break room, whispers followed her like a cold draft. "It's a PR stunt," whispered Claire, a junior executive with an Ivy League degree and a sharp tongue. "Sterling is just trying to look like a philanthropist. She probably doesn't even know how to open a spreadsheet." Martha heard them. She was used to being ignored, but being mocked was different. She walked into the break room to get a coffee, and the silence that followed her entry was deafening. She didn't say a word. She simply filled her cup and left. Arthur, observing from the hallway, felt a surge of anger. He realized that changing a person's title was easy, but changing a culture of arrogance was a war. He decided he wouldn't fight this battle for Martha. He knew she was stronger than all of them, but he would provide the stage for her to prove it. 2 weeks later, the biotech wing faced a critical issue. A series of samples for a new life-saving drug had been contaminated during the stabilization process. The lead scientists were panicking. Millions of dollars were at stake, but more importantly, the clinical trials were set to begin in 3 days. "We can't find the source of the pH imbalance," the head researcher, Dr. Aris, shouted during an emergency meeting. "We've checked the filters, the chemicals, the sensors. Everything is perfect on paper, but the culture is dying." Arthur stood at the back of the room, watching the experts argue. Martha was sitting in the corner, quietly reviewing the maintenance logs of the laboratory, the very logs she used to sign when she was a cleaner. She stood up slowly. "Dr. Aris? May I say something?" The room went quiet. Dr. Aris looked at her with a mix of exhaustion and condescension. "Mrs. Miller, we are discussing molecular degradation. It's a bit more complex than floor wax." Claire, the junior executive, stifled a giggle. Martha didn't flinch. She walked to the whiteboard. "The pH imbalance isn't coming from your chemicals. It's coming from the cleaning agents used on the ventilation intake grates. The new third-party cleaning crew is using a high ammonia solution to save time. At 3 a.m., when the laboratory's humidity peaks, the ammonia gas reacts with the condensation in the intake. It drips into the open vats." The scientist stared at her. "How would you know that?" Dr. Aris asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Because for 15 years, I smelled every chemical that entered this building," Martha said calmly. "I know the difference between the scent of a clean room and the scent of a shortcut. If you check the grates above vat 4, you'll find the residue. Dr. Eris rushed out of the room. 10 minutes later, he returned, his face pale. She's right. The intake is coated in ammonia residue. We would have spent weeks looking at the formulas while the answer was in the air. He looked at Martha, really looking at her for the first time. I apologize, Martha. I was the one who was blind. Arthur, standing by the door, felt a deep sense of pride. He looked at Claire and the other skeptics. They couldn't even meet Martha's eyes. A month later, Arthur was working late in his office when his secretary buzzed him. Mr. Sterling, there is a young man here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's regarding Martha Miller. Send him in, Arthur said immediately. A tall, lean young man walked in. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, but he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. He had Martha's eyes, deep, intelligent, and kind. Mr. Sterling. I'm David. Martha's son. Arthur stood up and walked around his desk to shake the young man's hand. It's an honor to meet you, David. I've heard a lot about you. David took a deep breath. I came here because I wanted to thank you. My mother told me everything. But I also came here because I wanted to give you this. He handed Arthur a small, old-fashioned piggy bank made of ceramic. It was heavy. What is this? Arthur asked. That's the emergency fund, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Since I was 7 years old, every time my mom found a coin on the street or had a few cents left over from groceries, she put it in there. She told me it was for my doctor's office one day. There's about $300 in there, mostly in nickels and dimes. David looked Arthur in the eye. I know you're a billionaire. I know $300 is what you spend on a lunch. But this is the most valuable thing my family owns. I want you to take it and put it toward that scholarship fund you started. Arthur looked at the ceramic bank. He felt more humbled by this small object than by any multi-billion-dollar contract he had ever signed. David, I can't take this, Arthur whispered. Please, David insisted. My mother taught me that you don't accept a hand up without reaching back to pull someone else up too. You gave her back her dignity. This is our way of helping you give it to someone else. Arthur sat down, holding the piggy bank as if it were made of glass. Your mother is the most remarkable person I have ever met, David. I know, David smiled. But the amazing thing is, she thinks you are the hero for finally seeing her. Arthur looked away, his eyes stinging. He realized that for years, he had tried to buy respect with money, but Martha and David were giving it to him for free, simply because he had decided, for once, to be a decent human being. Despite Arthur's sincere transformation, the ghosts of his past arrogance continued to haunt him. The annual Sterling Gala was approaching, and Arthur had decided to use this night to officially launch the Sterling Miller Scholarship Fund. However, his peers in the high society business world viewed his devotion to a cleaning lady as a sign of mental weakness. The day before the gala, Arthur's longtime rival and former partner, Julian Vane, walked into his office. Julian was a reflection of who Arthur used to be, ruthless, materialistic, and viewing people only as numbers on a balance sheet. Arthur, this joke has gone far enough, Julian said, sipping an expensive scotch. Promoting a janitor to the board? Starting a fund in her name? You're becoming a laughingstock in the markets. People think you've gone soft. They think you're losing your edge. Arthur looked out the window. In the past, these words would have made him defensive or furious. Now, he felt only pity. Julian, Arthur said calmly. For decades, I built massive towers but never bothered to look at the people inside them. Martha taught me that the foundation of a building isn't concrete, it's dignity. If my reputation suffers because I show a human being the respect she earned, then let it suffer. Julian stood up with a mocking smirk. When you put that woman on stage tomorrow night, Arthur, don't expect applause. They won't see a hero. They'll only see the stain of her uniform. Arthur didn't sleep that night. He wasn't afraid of Julian being right, he was afraid of Martha being hurt by the coldness of a world he had helped create. The ballroom of the Grand Excelsior was filled with the scent of lilies and the shimmer of crystal chandeliers. The city's elite moved through the room like sharks in silk. Martha arrived not in the diamond-encrusted gown Arthur had offered to buy her, but in a simple, elegant navy blue dress she had purchased with her own hard-earned savings. When the time came for the keynote speech, Arthur stepped behind the microphone. The room fell into a hushed, judgmental silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice steady. "Tonight, I intended to talk to you about profit margins and growth. But instead, I want to talk about blindness. My own blindness." He told the room about Martha. He told them about the molecular biologist who traded her lab coat for a mop to save her son. He told them about the ammonia in the vents that only she was smart enough to detect. And he told them about the $300 piggy bank filled with nickels and dimes, a fortune built on sacrifice. "I spent my life thinking I was the one providing jobs," Arthur said, looking directly at Julian Vane. "But Martha Miller was the one providing the soul that this building lacked. I am honored to introduce my partner and the co-founder of this legacy, Martha Miller." As Martha stepped onto the stage, the silence was deafening. Just as Julian had predicted, no one clapped. The elite looked at their shoes or their champagne glasses. Martha stood under the burning spotlights, her hands trembling. Then, a voice cried out from the very back of the hall. "She saved my mother." A young waiter, standing by the service doors, had stepped forward. 10 years ago, my mother was a cleaner here. She fell ill, and we had no money for medicine. Martha Miller gave us her own rent money. She worked double shifts so my mother wouldn't lose her job. She is the reason I have a family today." Then, Frank the security guard stood up from his post. "When my daughter got into college, Martha sent her books and food every week for 4 years. She never asked for a thank you. She just said, 'Pass it on.'" One by one, the invisible people of the room, the servers, the guards, the technicians, began to clap. The sound grew into a roar, a thunderous standing ovation that eventually forced the billionaires to stand up too. They weren't clapping for a cleaner, they were clapping for a giant. After the gala, the ballroom was empty except for Arthur and Martha. The moonlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows over the discarded silk ribbons. "Thank you, Arthur," Martha said. She no longer called him Mr. Sterling. "You didn't just give me a job or a fund. You gave me back my voice." Arthur smiled, a genuine, warm smile that had been missing for years. "Actually, I should thank you, Martha. You gave me the only thing my money couldn't buy, a conscience." At that moment, David joined them. He was holding an envelope from the Royal Academy. "Mom, I got the placement. I've been accepted as a chief resident, and they've asked me to lead the new ethical medicine initiative." Martha's eyes filled with tears. 15 years of scrubbing floors, 15 years of being ignored, 15 years of silence, it was all redeemed in that single moment. The debt was paid in full. Years passed. The Sterling Miller Scholarship Fund became the largest of its kind in the country, turning the children of laborers into scientists, engineers, and artists. Arthur Sterling eventually retired. He sold his penthouse and moved to a modest house with a large garden. He spent his days reading and visiting the schools he helped fund. He was no longer the king of the tower, and he was much happier for it. On his last day at Sterling Tower, Arthur sat in his empty office. He picked up a small, yellowed piece of paper from his desk, the original origami crane Martha had left years ago. He realized that this small bird, made of scrap paper, was worth more than all the gold in his vaults. That he walked to the window and looked down. He didn't see ants anymore. He saw people. He saw stories. He saw Martha, who was now a celebrated consultant, walking across the plaza, her head held high. The millionaire had finally learned that true wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give away. And as he walked out of the office for the last time, he left a small paper crane of his own on the desk for the next person to find. Long before the glass walls of Stirling Tower existed, the city was a different kind of monster. 20 years ago, Martha Miller, then known by her maiden name, Martha Novikova, stepped off a bus at the central station. She carried 2 heavy suitcases and a 4-year-old David, who was clutching her hand tightly. Behind her was a life of prestige. In Prague, she had been a rising star in the world of biochemistry. She had spent her days in sterilized labs, peering through microscopes at the building blocks of life. Her husband, Thomas, had been a poet and a teacher. They had lived in a small apartment filled with books and the scent of jasmine, but Thomas had fallen ill with a rare respiratory condition. The doctors in Europe had shaken their heads, but there was a specialist in this city who offered a glimmer of hope. They had sold everything, their books, their furniture, Martha's grandmother's jewelry, to buy 3 tickets to a new world. The first winter was brutal. The hope they chased turned out to be a series of expensive, unsuccessful treatments. Thomas's health declined rapidly, and within 6 months, Martha was a widow in a country where she barely spoke the language, holding a mountain of medical debt. "Mama, why are we living in a basement?" little David had asked one night, shivering under a thin blanket. Martha had looked at her hands, hands that were trained to handle delicate pipettes and complex chemical formulas. She looked at the bills on the table. She had a choice: she could weep, or she could work. "We are living here so you can grow up to build a house in the clouds, David," she whispered. The next morning, she walked into a domestic service agency. The woman behind the desk looked at Martha's resume, full of Latin honors and scientific publications, and laughed. "We don't need a scientist, honey," the woman said, blowing smoke from a cigarette. "We need someone who can scrub grease off a stove without complaining. Can you do that, or are you too educated for it?" Martha took a deep breath. She reached for the application form. "I can clean better than anyone you've ever hired," she said firmly. She wasn't lying. She approached cleaning with the same precision she had used in the lab. She studied the chemical compositions of detergents, she understood the physics of friction. She became the most efficient cleaner in the city, but to the people she served, she became a ghost. That it was 5 years later when Martha first walked into Stirling Tower. The building was brand new, a monument to Arthur Stirling's ego. Arthur was in his 30s then, already a millionaire, already convinced that the world revolved around his whims. Martha was assigned to the executive floor. She remembered the first time she saw him. Arthur was screaming at a subordinate because a flight had been delayed. He looked through Martha as if she were made of glass. "Move that bucket, woman," he had barked, not even glancing at her face. "You're in the way of progress." Martha had moved the bucket. She didn't feel insulted, she felt invisible, and in that invisibility, there was a strange kind of power. She began to observe the world of the great men. She saw their greed, their insecurities, and their loneliness. She saw Arthur stay late every night, not because he loved his work, but because he had no one to go home to. She saw the way he checked his reflection in the glass, looking for a flaw that wasn't there. One evening, while cleaning Arthur's office, she found a draft of a speech he was writing for a charity event. It was full of hollow words about helping the less fortunate. Martha noticed a glaring error in his logic regarding the statistics of poverty in the urban sector. For a second, she held a red pen over the paper. She wanted to correct it. She wanted to show him that the cleaning woman knew more about socioeconomics than his highly paid speechwriters, but then she heard David's voice in her head, reminding her of his tuition fees. She put the pen down. To be smart was a luxury she couldn't afford. To be silent was her only way to survive. She finished the floor, left a small paper crane made from a discarded memo on his desk, the first of many, and disappeared into the night. As the years passed, the physical toll on Martha grew. Her joints ached from the dampness of the floors, her lungs were tired of the bleach fumes. But David was thriving. He was a straight-A student, a boy with a heart of gold who spent his weekends at the public library. "Mom, look at this," David had shouted when he was 16, showing her a letter. He had won a regional science fair. Martha had hugged him, her heart swelling with a pride that no millionaire could ever understand. "You have the gift, David. Never let it go." But tragedy struck in David's senior year of high school. A minor injury on the football field revealed a deeper issue. He needed a surgery that Martha couldn't afford. Even with her 3 jobs, she had gone to the HR department at Sterling Tower, hoping for an advance on her pay. "We don't give advances to contract workers, Martha," the manager had said, not looking up from his computer. "It's company policy. If we do it for one, we have to do it for all the janitors." Martha had stood there, her heart breaking. She looked through the glass window toward Arthur's office. He was laughing with a client, celebrating a deal that had just earned him millions. To him, the cost of David's surgery was the price of a bottle of wine. To her, it was the world. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She went back to her mop. That night, she sold the last thing she owned. Her wedding ring. It was the only night she didn't leave a paper crane on Arthur's desk. 3 years before Arthur found the envelope, the city experienced the coldest winter in its history. The pipes in Martha's apartment building froze, and the heating system failed. David was in his 2nd year of medical school, buried under a mountain of textbooks and the crushing pressure of his exams. Martha was working 60 hours a week. She had taken an extra shift at a local hospital, cleaning the emergency room floors from midnight to 6 a.m., before heading to Sterling Tower for her regular day shift. She was surviving on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee. One morning, as she was buffing the floors in the lobby of Sterling Tower, Arthur walked in, draped in a coat made of cashmere and vicuña. He was complaining loudly into his phone about the unacceptable temperature in the building. "It's 68 degrees in my office, Harold. I pay millions for climate control. Fix it." Arthur shouted that he walked right across the wet floor Martha had just cleaned. His heavy boots left muddy streaks across the polished marble. Martha didn't say a word. She simply waited for him to pass and then began to clean the same spot again. Arthur stopped and turned around. "You missed a spot there, Martha. Or are you getting too old to see the dirt?" Martha looked up. Her eyes were sunken, and her skin was pale from exhaustion. "I'll get it, Mr. Sterling. My apologies." Arthur checked his watch. "Make sure you do. First impressions are everything, and I have investors coming in. If this lobby isn't perfect, it reflects on me." He didn't notice that Martha's hands were shaking. He didn't notice that she was wearing a summer sweater under her uniform because she had given her only heavy coat to David so he wouldn't get sick during his finals. To Arthur, she wasn't a woman struggling to survive, she was a faulty tool that needed to work better. That same winter, David's scholarship was threatened. A private donor had pulled back their funding, and the university demanded an immediate stability fee to keep him in the program. Martha sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the red, past due notices. She had already sold her jewelry. She had no more furniture to part with. The only thing she had left was her health. She began to skip meals. She told David she was eating at the office, and David, blinded by his own exhausting studies, believed her. In reality, Martha was living on crackers and water. She lost 15 pounds in a month. One evening, while cleaning the boardroom after a particularly lavish dinner Arthur had hosted for some oil tycoons, Martha saw the leftovers. Trays of untouched lobster, prime rib, and expensive cheeses were being thrown into large black trash bags by the catering staff. "Wait," Martha whispered to one of the young servers. Could I take some of that home? It's just going to the bin." The server, a young man who looked as tired as she was, nodded and handed her a plastic container. Martha felt a sting of shame as she tucked the container into her cleaning cart. She, a woman who once discussed molecular structures in world-class laboratories, was now scavenging for scraps like a stray dog. As she was leaving, Arthur walked back into the room to retrieve his forgotten cufflinks. He saw the container in her cart. "Stealing leftovers, Martha?" he asked, his voice dripping with a mix of amusement and disgust. "I didn't realize I was running a soup kitchen." "It was being thrown away, sir," Martha said, her head bowed. Next time, ask for permission. It's about the principle of the thing, Arthur said, turning away. It's a bad look for the company. Martha walked home in the snow that night, clutching the container of cold lobster. She gave it to David, telling him she had won it in a staff raffle. As she watched her son eat, her stomach growled in hunger, but her heart felt a strange, bitter victory. She was willing to be a thief, a ghost, or a fool, as long as David became a doctor. The weeks leading up to the night Arthur found the envelope were the hardest. Martha's limp had become a constant pain. Her lungs, damaged by years of inhaling harsh industrial cleaners in poorly ventilated basements, had developed a chronic cough. She knew she was reaching her breaking point. She began to write letters, just in case. She wrote to David, telling him where the small amounts of money were hidden. She wrote to the academy, pleading for their patience, and, in a moment of strange impulse, she wrote a letter to Arthur Sterling. She never intended to give it to him. It was a letter of, what if? What if you knew that the woman who empties your trash was once your equal? What if you knew that every time you insulted me, you were insulting a mother who is doing more for the future of medicine than your entire board of directors? I don't want your money, Arthur. I just wanted you to see me. She kept that letter in the same brown envelope that contained David's medical transcripts. The night of the storm, the night the story began, Martha was at her lowest. She had fainted earlier that day in the supply closet, her body finally protesting the lack of food and rest. When she saw Arthur in the hallway that night, she felt a wave of dizziness. When she dropped the envelope in the rain, she didn't just lose papers. She felt like she had dropped her soul. She stood in the parking lot, the rain soaking her to the bone, screaming silently at the sky. She was sure that this was the end. She was sure that her 15-year sacrifice had ended in a puddle of muddy water. She went home, sat in the dark, and waited for the phone call that would tell her David was expelled. She waited for the final failure. She had no idea that at that very moment, the man she had loathed for 15 years was speeding through the rain, holding her life in his hands, finally beginning to wake up from his lifelong sleep of greed. 10 years had passed since the night of the gala. Sterling Tower was no longer just a symbol of financial power, it had become a beacon of social change. The Sterling Miller model was being studied in universities across the globe, a blueprint for how a corporation could thrive by treating its most humble workers as its most valuable assets. Arthur Sterling was now 80 years old. He had long since stepped down as CEO. He spent most of his days in a quiet library he had built in the heart of the city's poorest neighborhood. He didn't wear Italian suits anymore, he wore comfortable sweaters and carried a wooden cane. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur received an invitation to the opening of the Novikova Miller Research Hospital. It was a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to treating the same respiratory illness that had taken Martha's husband years ago. The head of the hospital was none other than Dr. David Miller. As Arthur arrived at the ceremony, he saw Martha. She was older, her hair a beautiful snowy white, but her eyes were as sharp and intelligent as ever. She was no longer a consultant, she was a woman whose name was etched in stone above the hospital doors. They sat together in the front row, watching David take the podium. I am here today, David said to the crowd of doctors and reporters. Not because I was the smartest student, but because two people refused to let me fail. One was a mother who hid her brilliance behind a mop to keep me fed. The other was a man who had the courage to admit he was wrong and used his power to fix a world he had helped break. Martha reached out and took Arthur's hand. Her grip was firm, the hands of a woman who had worked hard and finally found rest. We did it, Arthur, she whispered. Arthur looked at the crowd. He saw hundreds of young people, the first graduates of the scholarship fund. He saw former janitors who were now engineers, and the children of security guards who were now lawyers. He realized that his bank balance had never made him a billionaire. It was this, the sight of 1,000 futures saved, that made him truly wealthy. After the ceremony, Arthur asked David to drive him back to Sterling Tower one last time. He wanted to see the office where it all began. The building was bustling with life. As they walked through the lobby, Arthur noticed something. A young man in a maintenance uniform was cleaning a spill near the elevators. Arthur stopped. Son, Arthur said, leaning on his cane. The young man looked up, startled. Yes, sir. Arthur reached into his pocket and handed the young man a small, gold-edged card. It was a direct line to the scholarship committee. Do not just clean the floors. Study the building. Understand the chemistry of what you do. And when you are ready to be more than what the world sees, call this number. We are waiting for you. The young man stared at the card, then at Arthur, his eyes widening with hope. Arthur walked to the elevators, a small smile on his face. He went up to the 42nd floor. His old office was now a community space, filled with young entrepreneurs and students. In the center of the room, encased in a small glass display, was a single, yellowed paper crane. That it was the original crane Martha had left on his desk 25 years ago. Arthur stood before it and closed his eyes. He thought of the shame he once felt, the burning U-tank, shame, that had transformed his life. He realized that shame was not a cage, it was a doorway. It had led him from the cold tower of his ego into the warm heart of humanity. That he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Martha. It's time to go home, Arthur, she said gently. I am home, Martha, he replied. That as they walked out together, the sun set over the city, casting a golden light on the skyscrapers. The millionaire and the cleaner, two equals, two friends, disappeared into the glow of a world they had cleaned, not with soap and water, but with justice and love.